Clara Wren found the bread on her porch before the sun had cleared the ridge. 2 loaves, wrapped in brown paper, set neatly beside the door and held down by a smooth river stone. Gray and round. The kind a man might pick from a creek bed without thinking unless he meant for it to stay. She stood there in her faded dress with one hand on the doorframe and the other holding the latch behind her, looking at that bread like it might accuse her of something. No note. No name. No boot tracks clear enough to read after the night wind had dragged dust across the yard. Only bread. Her stomach tightened before her pride could stop it. The day before, she had laid 13 cents on the counter at Slade Freight and Provision and watched Vernon Slade count them without ever looking at her face. The store had smelled of tobacco, axle grease, burlap, and flour sacks stacked high enough to make hunger feel personal. Outside, Cinder Mesa burned under summer light. Inside, the air was dim and mean with shade. "I need bread," Clara had said. "Whatever 13 cents will buy." Slade looked down at the coins. 2 nickels, 3 pennies, every one of them earned, found, traded, or saved from the small ruin her life had become. "Bread is 15 cents, he said. "Then half a loaf." "I do not sell half loaves. The end pieces." Then, he smiled as if she had asked a foolish thing in polite company. "Store policy, Mrs. Wren." She did not move her hand from the counter. She could see flour behind him, coffee tins, salt pork, beans, crackers in barrels, sugar locked in glass jars, white and clean as church linen. "Mr. Slade," she said, keeping her voice level, "you know I will pay the difference when I can. I know many things." He touched one finger to the account book beside him. "I know the note on Black Comet comes due faster than you seem prepared for. I know your late husband borrowed against that claim with his own signature. I know interest does not pause for grief." The words landed quiet. That made them worse. Clara had signed some of those papers beside Eli, because Eli had looked tired and certain and told her it would carry them through one bad season. One season had become a debt. Debt had become notices. Notices had become Slade, saying her land would be easier to manage under a wiser hand. "The claim is not for sale," she said. Slade swept the 13 cents back across the counter. "Then bring me 15 cents, he said. "And we can talk about bread." She picked up the coins. She did not cry. She did not beg. She turned and walked out into the white hammer of the afternoon. Past the freight wagons. Past the ore scale. Past 2 men who stopped talking only after she had already heard enough. She had not known anyone was watching from the back of the store. Asa Mercer stood near a coil of rope he had no intention of buying. He had come down from the high ridge to trade pelts and buy powder, coffee, and a new clasp for his pack. He came to Cinder Mesa 3 or 4 times a summer. Less if he could manage it. Towns had too many voices, and most of them wanted something. But he watched Vernon Slade refuse bread to a hungry widow. He watched Clara Wren put her coins away with hands that shook only after they closed. He watched Slade mention the Black Comet claim in the same breath as food. That was the part that stayed with him. A hungry person was one kind of trouble. A hungry person with land someone rich wanted was another. Asa waited until Clara had gone far enough down the street not to see him cross to Milo Harker's bakery, a low adobe place near the livery where the ovens worked before dawn, and the old baker cursed heat like it had insulted his mother. "Bread?" Milo asked. "2 loaves. For you." "No." Milo looked at him then. Asa placed $1 on the counter. "Woman in the gray dress. Widow Wren. Tell me what Slade wants from her." Milo wrapped the bread slowly. "Black Comet," he said. "Her husband's mine claim. Eli died in the East Shaft 6 months back. Slade holds the note now. Been squeezing her since the funeral. What sits under the claim?" Milo's eyes narrowed. "Silver. If talk is true." Asa picked up the bread. "That all?" "No," Milo said. "It is never all with Slade." So before sundown, Asa rode to the edge of the pines where Clara's cabin leaned against the rocky rise Eli had built it on. He did not knock. He set the bread on the porch, weighted it with the river stone, and left before the woman inside could owe him gratitude. Now Clara stood over those loaves in the morning heat. With 13 cents in her dress pocket and a debt notice folded on her table, she picked up the river stone first. It was cool in her palm. Inside the cabin, in the drawer of Eli's old desk, Slade's latest notice waited with its careful language and ugly meaning. 3 days. 3 days to pay. 3 days to sign. 3 days before a man who owned the store, the freight yard, and half the sheriff's attention came for the only thing Eli Wren had left her. Clara lifted the bread. Her pride hurt. Her hunger hurt worse. She carried the loaves inside and set the river stone on the windowsill. Not as thanks. Not yet. As evidence that someone had seen what Cinder Mesa had trained itself not to see. The bread lasted 4 days, because Clara made it last. She cut each slice thin with Eli's old knife, and saved the heels for gravy she did not have. In the mornings, she ate, standing by the stove with one hand around a tin cup of water and the other resting on the back of a chair, as if sitting down would admit how tired she was. The river stone stayed on the windowsill. She told herself it meant nothing. Then she looked at it every morning. On the 5th day, she heard boots on the porch. Clara was at Eli's desk with Slade's notice spread open before her, reading the same line for the 3rd time. The interest had been written in careful figures, the kind that looked honest until a body tried to live under them. Her hand moved to the kitchen knife before thought could catch up. 2 knocks came. Not hard. Not friendly either. Measured, she stood, crossed the room, and opened the door only as far as the latch chain allowed. A man stood on the porch with a flour sack in one hand and a coffee tin in the other. Sun had browned his face, and the wind had cut small lines at the corners of his eyes. His hat was plain. His shirt was canvas, faded at the shoulders. He stood still in the way of men who had learned that sudden movement made animals and people nervous. "You," Clara said. He looked at the knife in her hand, then back to her face. "Asa Mercer. I did not ask your name." "No, ma'am." She looked down at the flour, the coffee, the side of salt pork wrapped in paper, and a small sack of beans set carefully by his boot. "I did not ask for those either." "No. Then why are they on my porch?" "Because Slade had the whole store," he said. "And you had 13 cents. The words made the room behind her feel smaller. Clara opened the door wider. Not because she trusted him, but because she did not want to speak through a chain like a prisoner in her own house. "I will not be kept by charity. I am not asking to keep you." Men rarely call it that at first. Something in his face changed. Not offense. Recognition. He set the coffee tin on top of the flour sack and stepped back from it. "Then call it a debt?" he said. "Pay when you can. Or do not. I will not collect." "That is not a debt. That is a trap with softer words." Asa looked past her, not into the cabin, but toward the desk where Slade's notice lay in the open. "Slade writes traps," he said. "Mine are not that clean." Clara did not like that he had noticed the paper. She liked less that he was right. "You know Vernon Slade. I know the kind of man he is. That is not the same." "No," Asa said. "It is usually worse." A long silence stretched between them. Outside, heat moved through the pine needles with a dry whisper. Far off, a freight wagon groaned on the Cinder Mesa road. Clara lowered the knife but did not put it down. "Come in," she said at last. "Long enough to explain what you think you know." He carried the supplies to the table and stopped there, as if the rest of the cabin required permission too. Clara noticed. The flour sack went down first, then coffee, salt pork, beans, a paper twist of pepper. Enough food to change the shape of 2 weeks if handled carefully. She touched nothing. Asa removed his hat. "I asked questions," he said. "About me. About Slade. That is almost worse. He holds notes on more land than a storekeeper needs. Bought up claims after cave-ins. Fevers. Failed crops. Men sign because they need powder, flour, rails, timber. Then the terms shift. Clara folded her arms. Everyone knows that. Everyone knowing a thing is not the same as someone saying it. Her eyes moved to the notice on the desk. Asa followed the glance. He wants Black Comet because there is silver under it. The cabin went quiet. Not peaceful. Hollow. Clara stared at him. Who told you that? Milo Harker heard talk. Benton Ace heard more. Slade had a private survey run 6 months before Eli died. She felt her husband's name like a hand on her shoulder. Eli never said. Maybe he did not know. Eli knew his ground. Asa did not argue. That steadied her more than agreement would have. Clara went to the desk and opened the drawer where Eli's mine papers lay tied in faded cord. She placed them on the table between them, but kept one hand over the knot. If I let you look, she said, you do not take anything from this house. No. You do not speak for me in town. No. And you do not make promises because you like the sound of yourself making them. At that, the corner of his mouth moved. Wouldn't know how. She believed that more than she meant to. They spent the next hour sorting papers under the dull afternoon light. Timber invoices, powder receipts, shaft sketches, debt notices, Slade's numbers, Eli's handwriting, cramped and steady, running along margins like a man trying to leave order behind. Then Clara stopped. There, beside a rough drawing of the east wall. Eli had written one line. Slade sent a man down. Said routine safety check. East wall looked wrong after. Clara read it once. Then again. Asa did not reach for the page. He leaned forward only enough to see. That, he said quietly, is worth more than flour. Clara's fingers tightened on the paper. Outside, the heat pressed against the cabin walls. Inside, the river stone sat on the windowsill. Still and gray. Holding down nothing now but the first piece of truth, Clara did not sleep with Eli's note in the drawer. She tried. She tied the papers back with the faded cord, set them inside the desk, shut the drawer, and sat across the room until the lamp burned low. But the word stayed open in her mind. Slade sent a man down. East wall looked wrong after. By midnight, she had moved the note. Not far. Just from the desk to the loose stone behind the fireplace, where Eli had once kept a few emergency dollars wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands were steady while she worked. That bothered her a little. Fear shook a person. Anger gave the fingers purpose. By morning, Asa Mercer was gone. He had left before first light without taking coffee, without waking her, without leaving any promise behind. Only his boot marks showed in the dust outside the porch, leading toward the ridge trail. Clara told herself that was proper. A man who came and went like weather should not be counted on like bread. Still, when the sun climbed and no horse appeared on the road, she looked once toward the pines. Only once. By noon, Sheriff Coyle Drum rode up to the cabin. He came alone, wearing his badge and the expression of a man who had already apologized to himself for what he was about to do. Clara opened the door before he knocked. Mrs. Wren, he said, removing his hat. Sheriff, Mr. Slade asked me to make sure you understood the notice. I can read. His eyes dropped. I know that. Then what part does he think I missed? Drum shifted his hat between both hands. He had been a broad man once. Now he looked softened by too many years of doing what was easier than what was right. 3 days, he said. Payment or signature. The signature gives him co-ownership. It settles the debt. It hands him the claim. The sheriff looked toward the dry yard. Then back at her. Papers say what papers say. Clara thought of Eli's handwriting behind the fireplace stone. No, she said. Papers say what someone writes on them. That is not always the same thing. Drum's face tightened, as if the words had found a place he kept poorly guarded. He put his hat on. 3 days. Mrs. Wren, I heard you the first time. After he rode off. Clara stayed in the doorway until dust swallowed horse and rider both. Then she shut the door and barred it. Not because she thought a plank could stop Vernon Slade, because doing something with her hands kept her from breaking the coffee cup on the floor. Asa returned late that afternoon. His horse was dusted white from the lower road, and a line of dried mud marked one cuff where no mud had fallen near Cinder Mesa in weeks. He stepped down from the saddle with a paper roll tied inside his coat. Clara saw it before he spoke. "You found something." "A copy of the survey." Her throat tightened. He came inside only after she stepped back. That mattered. He placed the roll on the table and untied it carefully. The survey was plain paper. Clean lines. Professional marks. A property description written just wrong enough to hide what it belonged to from a careless clerk, but not from a man looking hard. Asa touched one corner. Private land company in Pueblo held the copy, filed under another section number. Slade needed a date in case the silver ever went to court, but he did not want it tied too openly to Black Comet. Clara bent over the map. The old mine tunnel, the ridge, the dry wash, her cabin, all of it was there. Thin as thread and heavier than iron. "How rich?" she asked. "Rich enough to make bread cost 15 cents when 13 is all you have." She looked up. Asa's face did not soften, but his voice had gone quieter. "Clara, if we put this with Eli's note, it is enough to file a federal claim freeze." "What does that mean?" "It means Slade cannot force a transfer until the land office reviews fraud." "And Eli?" He did not answer too quickly. "That note raises questions. Questions are not justice." "No, but they are not silence either." Asa looked at her then, and for one breath neither of them moved. Outside, a raven called from the pines. Clara went to the fireplace, loosened the stone, and took out Eli's note. She laid it beside the survey. 2 papers, 1 dead man's warning, 1 living man's hunger. Together, they changed the air in the cabin. "We take them to the land office," she said. "At San Aurelio, full day's ride if we leave before dawn." "We? You said we first." "I did not. You were about to." That should not have made her want to smile. It did not quite. Then Asa's face changed. His eyes moved toward the window. Then the yard. Then the line of trees beyond the wash. "What?" she asked. "Someone followed me off the south road." Clara's hand moved toward the table where Eli's old revolver lay wrapped in cloth. Asa shook his head once. "Not in here." "Where?" "You should not stay in this cabin tonight." Her spine stiffened. "It is my cabin." "Yes. Then I stay. And if Slade sends men before dawn, they find you and the papers in the same room." The sentence landed cold and practical. She hated it because it was true. "Where do I go?" "Milo Harker's bakery. Take the papers. Take the money. Take what matters. And you." "I stay on the porch." "No." He looked at her. She did not know why the word had come so fast. She only knew the thought of him, sitting alone in the dark between Slade's men and her empty cabin, made something inside her pull tight. Asa picked up his hat. "I have slept in worse places." "That is not an answer." "No," he said. "It is just a fact." By sunset, Clara had packed the survey. Ellie's note. The notices. $6 in a jar. And 1 clean shirt. She locked the cabin, though both of them knew locks were mostly for honest men. At the bakery. Milo opened the back door before she knocked. "Figured trouble. Finally found your porch," he said. Clara stepped inside with the papers tucked under her coat. Behind her, the road went dark. And up at the cabin, Asa Mercer sat on her porch with a rifle across his knees, watching the place where the trail disappeared into the pines. Asa knocked on Milo Harker's back door before dawn. Clara was already awake. She had not slept so much as rested her eyes between the sounds of the bakery. Wood settling in the oven. Milo moving flour sacks. The soft scrape of a peel against brick. She sat at the kitchen table with Eli's note and the survey wrapped in oilcloth beneath her coat. When Asa stepped inside, Clara saw the bruise along his jaw. Dark, fresh. He took off his hat and looked at Milo first. "We need to ride." Milo's eyes went to the bruise. Then away. "Coffee's hot. No time." Clara stood. "How many?" Asa looked at her. "2. And..." They left. "Riding. Mostly." Milo muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer trying not to be one. Clara did not ask more. She had learned enough from the bruise, the dust on Asa's sleeves, and the fact that he was standing in front of her. Whatever Slade had sent to her cabin in the night had not gotten the papers. That had to be enough. They left Cinder Mesa while the town still slept. The road to San Aurelio ran south through dry country, then bent toward low hills, where aspen broke the heat into scraps of shade. Clara rode Eli's old mare with the documents inside her coat and the river stone in her saddlebag. She did not know why she had brought it. Maybe because a thing that had held bread down could hold courage too. Asa rode beside her at first. Then ahead, when the trail narrowed, he watched the land without making a show of it. Dust. Bends. Ridgelines. The dark places where scrub oak could hide a man. He did not talk much. That suited Clara. She had too much inside her for conversation. Near midday, they stopped at a creek thin enough to step over. The horses drank slowly. Clara wet her handkerchief and pressed it to the back of her neck. Asa filled the canteen. "You can still turn back," he said. She looked at him. "I mean, before it becomes official." It became official when Slade refused bread and asked for land in the same breath. He nodded once. No argument. By late afternoon, San Aurelio appeared in the distance, low and pale, its adobe walls sitting under the sun like they had been baked there. The federal land office stood near the end of the main road, with a flag hanging limp from a pole and dust gathered thick on the steps. Inside, the air smelled of paper, ink, sweat, and old leather. A clerk with spectacles looked up from his desk. "Business." Clara stepped forward before Asa could speak. "My name is Clara Wren. I hold the Black Comet claim outside Cinder Mesa. I need to file evidence for a federal claim freeze." The clerk's brows lifted. Asa remained by the door. Not in front. Not behind. Near enough. The clerk gave his name as Morrison and reached for a ledger. Evidence of what nature? Clara laid out the papers. First, Slade's debt notices. Then the private survey. Then Eli's note. Morrison read the survey twice. His face lost its bored office look. "This property description is mismatched." "Yes," Clara said. "But the boundary marks correspond to Black Comet." "Yes." He looked at Eli's note. "Your husband wrote this." "He did. You can swear to the hand. In front of any judge in Colorado." Morrison sat back slowly. The room had gone quiet enough for Clara to hear Asa shift his weight near the door. "This is serious." "Mrs. Wren, I did not ride all day because it was small." The clerk looked at her over his spectacles. Then he picked up his pen. The scratching sounded thin. Too thin for what it meant. Still, it moved. Line after line. Morrison entered the survey, the note, the debt notices, and Clara's statement into the federal record. He stamped the first page. Then the second, then the copy she would carry. The stamp came down hard. Once. Enough. Enough to hold Black Comet where Slade could not pick it up by night. Enough to make a widow's paper heavier than a rich man's hand. Enough to turn Eli's margin note into something the law had to look at. Morrison slid the copy across the desk. Federal freeze filed as of today. No transfer. Sally. Lien enforcement. Or ownership adjustment can proceed without review. Clara touched the stamped paper. Her name sat on it. Clear. Uncrowded. "Will this stop him?" she asked. Morrison did not dress the answer pretty. "It will stop the land. It may not stop the man." Asa's eyes moved toward the window. "Then we should leave." They bought cornmeal cakes and dried beef from a woman near the freight office and ate on a bench without tasting much. Clara kept one hand inside her coat where the stamped copy rested. For 6 months, paper had been something men brought to frighten her. Now paper sat against her ribs like a shield. They left San Aurelio before the sun dropped. 2 hours out. On the back trail through the aspen country. Asa pulled his horse up short. Clara stopped beside him. What? He was looking at the road ahead. Not the road exactly. The dust, the broken weed stems, the wrong quiet. 3 riders, he said, waiting near the south approach. Slade's. Likely. They want the papers. No. His voice was flat. The papers are filed. They know by now. Clara understood before he said the rest. They want me kept from speaking. Asa looked at her then. There was no comfort in his face. Only truth. There is a ridge trail, he said. Steep. Bad in the dark. Comes into town near Milo's bakery. Can the mare handle it? She is sounder than she looks. Clara looked toward the ridge, blackening under the evening sky. Then she tightened the reins. Then we go where they are not waiting. The mare climbed like an old woman with a grudge. Careful and stubborn. The ridge trail was stone. Dust. Root. And shadow. Clara had no room left for fear. Every breath went to keeping her seat. Every thought to the papers under her coat. By the time the lights of Cinder Mesa showed below, full dark had taken the valley. Milo's bakery lamp was still burning. Of course it was. When Clara stepped inside, her hands finally began to shake. Milo set coffee on the table and did not mention it. Asa stood by the door, listening to the town. Slade knows, Milo said quietly. He is at the saloon with Sheriff Drum and a lawyer from Denver. Clara placed the federal stamp copy on the table. The ink was dry. Her fear was not, then tomorrow, she said. He comes for me in daylight. Clara did not hide the next morning. That was the first decision. She made it before the coffee finished boiling in Milo Harker's bakery. Before the first wagon rolled down Cinder Mesa's main street. Before Asa Mercer finished checking the loads in both revolvers and setting them back where they belonged. Not in his hands. Not yet. The bakery smelled of yeast, coffee, hot brick, and the kind of work that began before sunrise, whether trouble was coming or not. Milo set a plate of bread and fried ham on the table. Clara ate because she knew hunger made fear louder. Asa stood near the back door, listening to the town wake. You could stay here, he said. No. He turned his head. If Slade comes to me in a back room, Clara said, he can call it private business. If he comes to me in the street, then Cinder Mesa has to decide whether it still knows how to see. Milo wiped flour from his hands on his apron. This town has been looking away a long while. Then it can start looking back today. The federal copy lay inside Clara's coat. Eli's note and the survey copies were wrapped flat beneath it. The river stone sat in her pocket, heavier than it had any right to be. Milo poured more coffee. I sent Mateo's boy for Judge Rowe, he said. He rode out before moonset. How long? If the horse holds and the judge is willing, maybe by noon, maybe sooner. And if Slade comes before then, Asa answered, then we make sure he does it with witnesses. Clara looked at him. Not with gunfire. No. Not unless there is no other breath left. His eyes held hers. That is how I meant it. That mattered. More than she wanted it to. They left the bakery as the sun broke hard over the roofs. Cinder Mesa did not wake gently. Shutters opened with dry groans. Horses stamped near the livery. Freight hands rolled barrels toward the depot shed. The ore scale stood beside Slade's yard, black and still. The iron platform stained with years of dust and silver grit. Clara walked straight down the middle of the street. Not fast. Not small. Asa stayed 2 steps behind her left shoulder. Close enough to be known. Far enough not to lead. People noticed. A woman sweeping the boarding house porch stopped mid-stroke. 2 miners outside the saloon lowered their cups. A boy at the freight yard forgot to pull the mule forward until the animal snorted and corrected him. Clara went first to Benton Ace's dry goods shop. He was unlocking the door when she stepped onto the porch. Benton looked at her face and did not ask if trouble was coming. What do you need? Stand where you can be seen. Clara said. If Slade speaks, listen. If he lies, remember what you know. Benton swallowed. He had the tired look of a man who had survived by bending until bending had become shame. I have records, he said quietly. Debt adjustments. 3 claims, maybe 4. Bring them. He nodded. Next she went to Mateo Rivas at the livery. He was tightening a girth on a bay mare. His sleeves rolled. His dark eyes already sharp. Judge Rowe's been sent for, Clara said. My boy will get him there. Mateo answered. Or kill that horse trying. Do not let him kill the horse. For the first time that morning, Mateo almost smiled. Then Clara's voice lowered. When Slade comes, I need you outside. I'll be there. And Milo. Already there, Asa said. Clara turned. The baker stood in front of his shop with his apron still on, arms folded across his belly, looking down the street toward Slade Freight and Provision. Not brave in the loud way. Brave enough. Others began to understand something was happening. Not all at once. Cinder Mesa had spent 12 years learning caution. Caution did not die because one widow carried stamped paper in her coat. But it shifted. A door opened. A curtain stayed pulled back. Mabel Price, who had lost her husband's claim 5 years earlier and never spoke of it above a whisper, stepped onto her porch with her gray hair pinned tight and her mouth set hard. Clara saw her. Mabel gave one small nod. It was not much. It was the first crack in a wall. By 7:30, the saloon doors opened. Vernon Slade stepped out into the light. He did not look angry now. That would have been easier. He looked washed, buttoned, and calm, as if he had spent the night deciding which knife would leave the smallest mark. Beside him walked Elias Voss, the Denver lawyer, narrow and polished, carrying a leather case. Sheriff Drum followed half a pace behind, badge dull in the sun. 2 of Slade's men came last, loose-handed and watchful. 5 men. One purpose. The street quieted until even the ore scale seemed to hold its iron breath. Slade saw Clara standing near the freight yard and smiled like they were meeting over bread again. Mrs. Wren, he called. Mr. Slade, I understand you have caused some confusion with federal papers. Clara's hand touched the folded copy inside her coat. No, she said. I have entered evidence into record. Voss opened his leather case. Mrs. Wren, I represent Mr. Slade's lawful financial interest in the Black Comet property. We have documents requiring your immediate answer. Asa's voice came from beside her, quiet and flat. You are a state attorney. Federal claim freeze came first. Voss looked at him. And you are a witness. Slade's smile thinned. Clara stepped forward before Asa could say more. The private survey is filed, she said, loud enough for the porches to hear. So is Eli Wren's note about the east wall. So are Slade's debt notices. Sheriff Drum shifted. Slade's eyes cooled. That note proves nothing. It proves enough to ask why my husband's mine wall looked wrong after your man went down. The street went still. If you believe a town can be guilty by silence, stay with Clara now, because the next words spoken in Cinder Mesa would decide whether she stood alone or whether 12 years of fear had finally grown tired of itself. Then Benton stepped out of his shop holding a ledger under one arm. Sheriff, he said, voice rough but steady. I have something to add. Benton stepped into the street with a ledger under his arm. And for the first time in 12 years, Vernon Slade looked at someone in Cinder Mesa as if he had miscounted. Sheriff, Benton said, I have records. Sheriff Drum did not move. His badge caught the morning sun and gave back nothing. Slade's voice stayed smooth. Benton, I would think carefully before making yourself part of a widow's confusion. Benton's hand tightened on the ledger. I have thought carefully for 2 years, he said. That is the trouble. He opened the book. 3 claims adjusted after the men died. 2 store accounts changed after signatures were already filed. 1 freight lien moved from goods to land without proper witness. The street held still. The ore scale beside Slade's yard stood black and empty, its iron platform waiting for weight. Then Mabel Price came down from the boarding house porch. She walked slowly, not because she was afraid, but because age had made every step honest. "My husband's claim," she said. "Copper Ridge. Slade changed the papers after Aaron died. I signed because there was no food left, and no man in this town would stand beside me." Slade turned his head. "Mabel." "No," she said. "You had my silence long enough." Another man stepped forward from the freight yard. Then a miner's wife. Then old Milo Harker. Flour still white on one sleeve. Not shouting. Not rushing. Just one voice. Then another. Until the street no longer belonged only to Slade. Elias Voss, the Denver lawyer, opened his case and closed it again. "Sheriff," Slade said, sharper now, "remove Mrs. Wren before this becomes a mob." Clara felt Asa beside her. Not in front. Beside. Sheriff Drum looked at Clara, then at Slade, then at the people lining the street. Faces he had known for years, and failed in smaller ways than law could easily name. He took one step toward Clara. "Mrs. Wren," he said, "there are questions that—" "No." A voice called from the north end of town. Everyone turned. Judge Elias Rowe rode in under a coat filmed with dust, his horse breathing hard from the long trail. Behind him came two federal marshals in gray coats, quiet men with tired eyes and clean authority. Mateo Rivas's boy had made the ride. Judge Rowe swung down with care, like a man saving his strength for words. "Sheriff Drum," he said, "you will not be taking Mrs. Wren anywhere." Drum's face changed. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. Judge Rowe took the federal copy from Clara's hand and read the stamp. "The freeze holds," he said. "Black Comet remains under Clara Wren's title until federal review is complete. No transfer, no lien enforcement, no private settlement." Slade's mouth tightened. "Your Honor, this is a local debt matter." "No," Rowe said. "It became federal when your hidden survey crossed property descriptions and a dead man's note named your inspection." The word dead moved through the street like cold water. Clara did not look down. Judge Rowe turned to Elias Voss. "Counselor, if there are papers in that case meant to pressure Mrs. Wren into signing against a federal freeze, you will surrender copies before sundown." Voss opened his mouth. The judge looked at him. "Choose your next words like you intend to keep practicing law." Voss closed his case. Judge Rowe looked back at Slade. "You will come with the marshals and answer questions before a federal magistrate." Slade's eyes moved once to Sheriff Drum. The sheriff looked away. That was when Slade understood the town had not become brave all at once. It had simply stopped being useful to him. One marshal touched Slade's shoulder. "No chains." "Not yet." But he walked between them past the ore scale, past the store he owned, past the people who had once lowered their eyes. The scale did not move. For once, nothing in Slade's yard weighed in his favor. Judge Rowe pointed toward Slade Freight and Provision. "Seal the freight ledger, the ore scale records, the lien copies, and the private account books. Nothing leaves that office without federal witness." A marshal crossed the street. The store bell rang once when he entered, then went quiet. Sheriff Drum removed his hat slowly. "Your Honor," he said, "I will cooperate with the proceeding." Judge Rowe studied him. "You will do more than cooperate. You will produce every notice your office carried for Mr. Slade in the past 5 years." Drum's face went gray, but he nodded. That was not forgiveness, but it was consequence. By noon, Clara gave her statement in Milo's bakery because Judge Rowe said the sheriff's office smelled too much like old arrangements. Benton signed his ledger pages. Mabel Price signed with a hand that shook but did not stop. Milo poured coffee until the pot went empty. Outside, one marshal pasted a federal notice on the door of Slade Freight and Provision. Another tied sealed paper across the ore scale gate. The store was not closed forever. Not yet. But for the first time since Clara had laid 13 cents on that counter, Vernon Slade's books were being counted by someone who did not owe him fear. Judge Rowe was careful with her. "The question of Eli Wren's death will take time," he said. The law moves slow. Clara folded her hands in her lap. "It has been slow for 6 months. "Yes," Rowe said. "But now it is moving." That was not enough to bring Eli back. Nothing was, but it was enough to keep his land from being stolen over his grave. Near sundown, Clara rode home with Asa beside her. They did not speak much. The high heat had broken, and the wind smelled of dust, pine, and far-off rain that might never come. At her cabin, Clara stepped onto the porch and found the riverstone still on the windowsill where she had left it. She went inside and opened the tin box. The 13 cents were still there. 2 nickels, 3 pennies, small enough to be refused, heavy enough to remember. She placed them on Eli's desk beside the federal receipt. Then she folded the old bread wrapper and tucked it beneath the riverstone on the sill. Bread, evidence, a name on paper. 3 things she had almost lost in different ways. Asa stood near the steps. Hat in hand. "I expect you will go back to the ridge," she said. That was the plan. He looked toward the darkening pines. "Plans change." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the cabin door. Not wide. "Enough. There is coffee," she said. Asa looked at the doorway. Then, at Hare. "I could use some." He did not step in until she moved aside. That mattered. Inside, Eli's papers rested on the desk. The federal receipt lay beside the 13 cents. The riverstone held down the bread wrapper on the sill, plain and gray in the last light. Clara put coffee on the stove. Asa set his hat on the chair, not the table. Outside, Cinder Mesa settled into evening without Slade's store bell ringing once. The town was not clean. The law was not finished. Eli was still gone. But Clara Wren's name was on the claim. Her door was opened by her own hand, and the man standing in her kitchen had waited to be asked. Not healed, not settled, but no longer silent. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.